38 out of 40 salad bars in Wisconsin were tested positive for parasites. So it's
Oh,
really, I know, so gross, right? It's not about it's on the meat or it's on the produce. It's actually, in our food supply chain. And they're in nature, like they're a part of nature, as are we. The question is, are you a good host? And is your child a good host for them? And are they allowed to set up shop, or can you and your child fend them off appropriately with a strong immune system?
Welcome to the Soaring Child podcast, where parents of children with ADHD learn tips and tricks to help their child soar at home, at school, and in life. We feature interviews with experts, medical professionals, and parents just like you who are learning how to reduce ADHD symptoms using food and other natural strategies. Because children with ADHD deserve to soar just like every other child. I'm Dana Kay, your host. Hello, parents. This is Dana Kay here with another edition of the Soaring Child podcast. Today, we're delving into a topic that could be a little bit gross, a bit creepy crawly, but really, really important for our health. A few years ago, maybe more than a few years now, my son came to me with a serious concern. His bum was itchy. And as a parent, you expect many types of complaints like, my tummy hurts, I'm hungry, 10 minutes after eating dinner, my socks feel weird. But at the time, that was a new one for me. And what I did, I told him, bend over, let's take a look. And what did we find? Tiny little pinworms making an appearance. Yes, right there, wriggling out. And it turns out that these little wrigglers were actually the party guests of another uninvited critter, and it was a parasite known as Dientomoeba fragilis, and it was living in his gut. Now, this unexpected at the time. I mean, I've looked at many squirrely things in my children's bottoms, but at the time, this really opened my eyes, and it opened my eyes wider to the silent world of parasites that affect so many of us, particularly our children, often without even our knowledge. And so to help us navigate this hidden world, I'm thrilled to have Sinclair Kennally join us today. Sinclair is a traditional naturopath. She is the co-founder of Meditation RX and the CEO of Detox Rejuvenation. She's not only an expert on chronic digestive disorders, but also a passionate believer that toxins, including those from parasites, are at the root of many of our health epidemics today. Along with her partner, Michael, Sinclair has turned her own journey through complex chronic illnesses into a mission to help thousands reclaim their health and vitality. Today, we are going to welcome Sinclair to the Soaring Child podcast. Hi, Sinclair. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's going to be so fun.
Oh, it is. I mean, it's fun talking about parasites. I know a lot of people out there are probably thinking, oh my gosh, how could talking about parasites be fun? But both you and I know it is. So maybe just start for our listeners by explaining what parasites are and how they actually typically get into our body.
Oh, that's such a great question. And I love this because it's really actually not unusual to be exposed to parasites. We think, oh, they must be far away. Like I haven't taken my kids on any exotic vacations.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't go to Bali. We didn't go to Mexico. I haven't been drinking, water in a third world country. But actually, you can get parasites all over the globe. It's not about whether or not you've been exposed to them, because they can be found in natural bodies of water, like rivers, lakes, but also there's even parasites that are, yes, chlorine resistant. And so that pool water that your kiddo is swimming in is not necessarily sanitized, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, they come in on food. There's a fun study I like to quote out of Wisconsin. 38 out of 40 salad bars in Wisconsin were tested positive for parasites. So it's
Oh,
really, I
oh,
know, so gross, right? It's not about it's on the meat or it's on the produce. It's actually, in our food supply chain. And they're in nature, like they're a part of nature, as are we. The question is, are you a good host? And is your child a good host for them? And are they allowed to set up shop, or can you and your child fend them off appropriately with a strong immune system?
I think that's a really good way to look at it, because we are going to get exposed to them. But yes, does your gut allow them to set up shop, to set camp up? Now, in what way? So, talk about a good host. What's a good host? What's a bad host? How do we know?
Oh, that's such a good question. The way that I think about it is this. If your toxin bucket is full, if your stress bucket is full, you're a better match to parasites. And because yes, parasites come at a huge cost. And yes, kiddos are more vulnerable to them because their immune systems are still evolving. There's a lot of reasons for that, actually. But what we want to consider is the main source of toxins is actually just living a normal lifestyle and being alive in this day and age.
Mhm.
We give toxins to our kiddos in utero, and they're now born with them in this generation. And so we get to acknowledge that and just plan for it and support, create a plan for how to support our families, because otherwise they will just keep building up from there. Toxins in our food, air, and water. Even if you're eating organic, you still are getting some cross contamination. There's still stuff in the soil. It's complex. And so that toxin bucket, the more it fills up in your child or you, is the reason, well, or one of the biggest reasons why your immune system is going to allow parasites to set up shop, because parasites can help hold on to toxins for you. Some parasites can hold up to several times their own body weight in toxins. In fact, that's what candida is doing for you. And, candida can be holding heavy metals. It can be holding mold and mycotoxins. Candida is a fungus. It's coming in behind mold and setting up shop. It's also holding things like pharmaceutical residues. You could be getting that in tap water. You may not even be drinking, or you may not even be taking pharmaceuticals, but you could still be subjected to the toxic burden of them, which
Mhm.
is frustrating, I know. But this is one of the reasons why I love talking about poison and parasites, because this is actually all fixable. We just have to learn how it works and then create a doable plan for the family, you know? But that really is the number one reason why you would be susceptible to parasites, is those toxins that overburden in the body, because that creates stagnation and your immune system is not as strong in that environment. And, yes, we'll add in some stress. So big T, little t trauma can absolutely impact the immune system as well. We know that now.
Yeah, definitely. And I talk a lot about that bucket, or I actually like to share a little trash can. For those that are watching, I've got my little trash can, and you're so right there. And look, when we know better, we do better. And none of the information that we share in the podcast is to say you need to go out and do all of these things and change all of these things, or to scare you. It's really about giving you that knowledge so you can take the appropriate steps to then help your child. Now, I'm curious, what ways do parasite infestations differ between children and adults? From your experience, are there sort of more specific types, more common to children over adults?
I used to say yes to that, and more, I feel like I've just seen it all. And maybe it's just because we get sensitive kiddos and the whole family issues, because parasites do spread across family members, and so there just is that reality. I'm curious as what your thoughts are on that. I do see pinworms up the yin yang with kiddos. Like
Mm-hmm.
that is just a very common story to share with your
Yeah.
son. And actually, I grew up hearing that story about my aunt, that she had just repeated pinworms as a kid, and they come crawling out, and they'd have to wake up in the middle of the night and put her in this special bath in the 1950s. God knows what was in that bath.
Wow.
I know. So
Yeah.
to each generation their own set of tools. But
Totally. Yeah, I do commonly see more Dientamoeba fragilis. That's one that I do generally see a lot with kiddos. But, as you said, you kind of see it all, don't you? And you sort of become immune to it. And very true that it does get transferred through the family and can be passed through. Now, I'm curious. Well, I know our listeners will probably be curious. What are some of the sort of key symptoms, I suppose, that someone might sort of think about when there might be a parasite infection, in particular neurological? We obviously, can assume that there would be gut symptoms as well, but can you just share some of those common symptoms?
I think this is a really important thing to understand because your parasites are creating digestive and immune disruption for your kiddos, but that they're also highly neurotoxic. And those neurotoxic side effects are going to present differently in children than they would in adults and in the elderly. It's still the same mechanism of irritation, inflammation, and damage ultimately, because parasites do have a consciousness. So they're always fighting back. Most of them don't want to kill you. They just want to make sure you're weak enough that they get to run the show and they get to eat your food first. And then every time they eat, they're creating, nutritional deficiencies in you, which again is going to present differently in kiddos versus adults and the elderly. But also they're excreting endotoxins. That's their own version of poison. That's their poop and pee that is highly neuroinflammatory. And so in kiddos, you're going to see a lot of misdiagnoses. Like this is why I'm so passionate about the work you do and your message in the world, because you're really demystifying this for families. ADHD, ADD, and anxiety presenting in young children is often a misunderstood response to parasites and to gut disruption, right? So, and of course, there are other toxins that directly create that picture for our children as well. Glyphosate creates that leaky gut on contact that can contribute to ADD and ADHD symptoms. Obviously we're learning more and more about food dyes and, their links to it. So it's a complex picture, but remember, parasites thrive in that environment. Yeah. So the more toxins you have like that, the more likely you are to have parasites also driving and contributing to that picture of neuroinflammatory conditions for your kiddos. Yeah. And I deeply believe this is why we're seeing this explosion of ADD and ADHD for our kids, but also early diagnoses of, depression and anxiety that just was not present in previous generations.
I know you raise a really good point there, and one that we've touched on the podcast, but not sort of dove too deep on it, and that is that rise in diagnosis. I, firmly believe that it is the rise in the exposure to all of these things that can create inflammation in the body, and what we talk about a lot in the podcast is inflammation exacerbates ADHD symptoms. So what I'm hearing you say is that, it can come out as anything and it will present differently. Inflammation can drive hyperactivity. It can drive mood dysregulation. It can drive gut symptoms, digestion symptoms. And so, if you have a child, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'd also like to reassure parents with, the food sensitivity, histamine sensitivity, like rashy kids, how frustrating that is. And that it's very common to see that presentation as well. Yes. So frustrating to hear from your pediatrician, oh, they usually grow out of that skin condition. It's like, but there's a good reason for it.
Yes.
How about we resolve it before their temperament is set and they create a story about themselves like, oh, I'm just someone who's anxious. I'm just someone who's brain foggy. I'm just someone who can't settle into my own body. That's not true about your child.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be their future,
Okay, well, you just brought up another point that I want to sort of go a little bit deeper on, and let's talk about parasites and traditional medicine. So generally, if we suspect a parasite in our child, we would take our child to the pediatrician. So from your experience, what happens when someone takes their child to the pediatrician for a parasite?
Usually the parents get dismissed, right? And you have to remember how our medical system works and the medical education system works. So they are wildly underprepared to actually assess for the root cause conditions of most inflammatory conditions today. So that means parasites and also environmental toxins. They get 7 hours, if that many, on environmental toxins in their entire medical education. And your MD, your pediatrician, is also being taught that parasites are only to look for them with a sudden, like wild drop of symptoms, with a clear source of exposure. And it's like, I had a healthy child, and then they went down for the count and they started seizing and they had no appetite. And it was like, and bam, like so extreme. And actually, parasites steal in over time. And they're great at being stealthy in the body until the symptoms mount and your child finally gets enough stress in the system that you experience a health crisis. So it's actually the opposite of what they're taught. And they're also taught that it's true that most parasites are invisible to the naked eye, right? They are monocellular, they are colonizing, pathogenic biofilms, et cetera. But worms are actually so much more common in children. Strongyloides is infecting over 100 million people worldwide every year, and many of those are children. Like, that's just, we have to understand that your pediatrician is fundamentally not prepared to assess for this, and it's not their fault.
Definitely not their fault. And yeah, I completely agree with that. And it's just kind of the same with nutrition, isn't it? It's like they do, I think, either 4 hours or 1 day of training on nutrition for their whole medical degree. So it is not their fault. They're just not trained in that specific area. So how do families sort of identify, if we don't go to our doctor to identify if they've got a parasite, how do our families identify whether their child has a parasite and if this is contributing to some of their health issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Here's what I look for. And I also want to remind parents that your child doesn't have to exhibit all of these. It's typically one bucket of symptoms is primary in the body, and then another bucket is kind of secondary. But you won't see all of these. So one for sure is ADD, ADHD, difficulty settling. And, depending on the child's age, you have to exercise some discernment here and understand what you're looking at, because some children simply don't get to go out enough and expend their energy appropriately. So part of what you're doing is, watching them with their peers and you exercising mama bear intuition about this, and how your child has shifted from one developmental stage to another. So yes, but there's also like sensitivity to light, getting, the headaches and migraines, the low end of the autism spectrum symptoms that have gotten normalized as neurodivergent can actually be a sign of parasite overload. So let's not jump too quickly with these labels before asking, could the body be supported to have, more resilient experience, like sensitivity to food textures, sensitivity to light and sound, difficulty engaging and maintaining connection, difficulty settling into their own bodies, fingers in their nose and their mouth. I mean, depending on the age, rectal itching, of course, the rashy kids, histamine sensitive kids. I have such a soft spot in my heart for them. That they come in with these food intolerances and you think, oh, it's genetics because they've always had them. Not necessarily. Their toxin bucket may have been full because of what mama went through, and of course parasites are going to take advantage of that. So I always look at the rashy kids for sure for this, but also issues with sleeping.
I was just about to say that one.
Right? This generation of kids is really struggling with sleep. And it's always something I check for because of that. What else would you add to the list?
Well, I was going to say definitely the sleep, because a lot of parasites come alive at nighttime. And, the pinworms is a perfect example of that one, because, they're not itchy during the day, but just as they're about to hit that pillow, Mom, my bum's itchy. That's because they come alive at nighttime. It's really most symptoms can tie back to these underlying root root causes that we talk about, parasites being one of them, because parasites, not only is that issue by itself, but it's what does it create from being in there? Does it create leaky gut? And then that, those endotoxins, if you've got that leaky gut, do they then go through the lining of the gut into the bloodstream? And then the body's creating inflammation. And when your child's melting down and having a tantrum, that's not normal. That's not just, oh, he's got ADHD, he's got emotional dysregulation. It happens every day. We've just got to accept it. No, it's not normal. Let's try and work out what is that underlying cause of what is contributing to that. So, okay.
I also love what you're saying here, because for parents listening to this and they're like, okay, but I've got one kid who's a bottomless pit, ADHD, climbing the walls, has to have sugar constantly, but will eat like 3 kids' meals in one. And then I have another kid who's super picky, texture sensitive, must have things separately, or they have a meltdown. I can barely get them to eat anything. Both of those in the same household can be driven by parasite issues.
Yep. That's
so it can be highly individualized across children.
It can be highly individualized across anyone. So, and I think that's the beauty of what we do, is because everyone is an individual. And I was just doing an Instagram live on this today, actually, and that's why it's in the forefront of my mind, is that like the traditional approach to ADHD is medication, but that medication we can't approach it as a one size fits all. It is, and so it will present in different ways, and we need to take that individualized approach for each child or for each adult or for whoever, we're talking about. Okay, so, a parent suspects parasites. What are some immediate steps they can take if they suspect their child might be suffering with parasites?
This is such a good question. And this is tough because I know we want there to be one lab that's going to be a very definitive answer. Does my child have parasites? Yes or no? And while it's true, labs are supportive and they can provide a window of information. That's how we look at them, right? Because commercially available testing is it's not there yet, guys. We'll be the first ones to tell you when it is. But you certainly can, test and do stool testing and things like that. But I would regard it as like a win if you see them on there. Okay. And remember that some of these tests have as low as 24% replication rates, which means not very reliable. And your tech reviewing the stool test may spend less than 13 seconds on it. So we just have to think like a parasite and say, well, is every parasite your child is overloaded with going to put the perfect amount of information in that smidge of stool for that tech to see? Not necessarily. So I know you want to do it. You're welcome to do it. Just recognize that there are limitations. It's not a conclusive no. Right? What do you think about labs? What do you want to share with people?
Yeah, I have definitely tried different labs over the years when it comes to stool testing, and no one perfect is out there. And I find with parasites, a lot of the time they hide in that mucus-like substance, which is the biofilm, as you mentioned earlier. And so a lot of the time they're not even there. And some of the testing out there is so outdated, hasn't been updated. But then you've got the new ones coming out on the market that are really focusing on the DNA of that, but they're just testing such a limited amount of parasites. So I love how you explained it to say that parasite's not going to give you the right amount of information in that one stool sample, so you can see whether or not you have a parasite. As you said, they're stealth. They're going to hide. They're going to do whatever they can to go undetected. So, yeah, I'm completely agree with you on that one.
Yeah, we think about it like this. If your child is presenting with a certain constellation of parasite symptoms, which we've gone over enough of them today that you probably are starting to have a parental intuition about this.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth exploring further. And we actually go to the symptomology first because it is the most reliable, right? And, you might encounter practitioners who really rely heavily on muscle testing. Again, I would consider that a layer of information at best. And it depends on the practitioner's understanding of what they're asking the body for. So I can't give carte blanche on that either. Sorry, guys. So we use the symptomology and we think about it. We're going to systemically assess, and address root causes, because root causes for parasites can be, tracked, for example, in urine labs. So we can do a tox panel on your child. We can test for mycotoxins, because you may not have any mold symptoms, but there might be a leak, behind the drywall in your child's bedroom from the bathroom on the other side, and they're breathing in mycotoxins at night, and it is invisible and it is silent. And that is so immune suppressive in nature. It could be the reason why that one child is really struggling with health, and your other kids are fine.
Yeah. I've seen it time and time and time again. And mold is another topic for another day, but it is really scary how silent it is, but how many homes or children are affected. I do an organic acid test. I find that that's a really good overview, a high level view of things. And we do see some of that mold, but the amount of kids that we actually see mold in, I would say it's 50 to 60% of kids.
Yeah, I would too. And I understand we're getting a skewed population because you have to be unwell to come to us. But so, okay, 1 out of 2 or more than 1 out of 2 children who is unwell.
Yeah.
As we have to look at this, especially because more than 1 out of 2 buildings in the United States have been water damaged. It's actually over 70%.
Wow.
Our construction guidelines are so poorly set up to protect people living in homes from mold. It's laughable. It's actually criminal, because it shows up differently in different ages, children versus adults versus the elderly. And we have to know that. So we got to get mold savvy. And yes, I love running urine panels for that reason. It's easy to do with your child. You can do it at home. There's no reason not to. It's a great place to start.
So what I'm hearing from you is that we really need to assess probably the host more than anything. It's like, what is that toxic load on that body, and what is breaking down that body and allowing, is it then allowing those parasites to take hold? So if you do work out your kid's got a parasite, whether or not you've seen it on a test or it's like symptomology, what do they do?
So I always recommend, wherever possible, a whole family approach, because exposures happen in families typically, and that's the toxin load that opens the door for the parasites so you can become a good host, but also the parasites themselves. So wherever possible, I want the parents in on doing their own protocol, in part because if they understand the tools and the process, you can be a better container for your child.
Totally.
Because make no mistake, you're working with a practitioner and they're the guide, but you're the enforcer, right? So you have to be able to, your nervous system has to hold the container for your child's healing journey. So we have a real emphasis on that. And then we find that works best. So what I want parents to hear from this is you get to be supported in this process. It is a project. There is an end date. But in order to have an end date, there's got to be a learning curve. So if you're willing to assess your child, please be willing to assess yourself as well, because we'll answer so many questions. And it will also get you guys out of that family dynamic of, the problem kiddo. We know that parents are only as happy as their sickest child. And it is so hard, to run a household where there's even one child that's unwell. But we also have to remember that you need the right support system in order to be their support system, So we have to explore that. It's always a negotiation.
Yeah, definitely. And look, I agree with you that when the parent actually goes through their own journey, they can completely relate so much better and can really help that child thrive in that process. I was actually just talking to someone the other day, and she was saying, actually interviewing her after working with her child, and she was saying she had been through a healing process herself prior to working with us, and if it wasn't for that, she wouldn't have understood what was what he was going through. But she was able to really, as you said, set the container for that child and through his journey and help him thrive even more. So I love that approach as well. So Sinclair, this has been eye-opening I am sure to many of the listeners today, I just want to, thank you for sharing your knowledge and your experience with our listeners. Please tell listeners where they can find and follow you online.
Oh, thank you, Hen. So you can find us on Instagram, Detox Rejuvenation, or my personal account, Sinclair Kennally. And I'm the host of Your Health Reset podcast, where we nerd out about all this stuff, which is wonderful. And you can find us at detoxrejuvenation.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you once again for joining me today. Listeners, if you found today's discussion enlightening, like I did, please share it with other parents and caregivers in your community. We all thrive when we're informed and we're supported. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Soaring Child podcast. I'm Dana Kate, your ADHD health practitioner. Keep on thriving. Thank you for listening to the Soaring Child podcast today. To learn more about how to help your child with ADHD soar using natural strategies, visit our website at adhdthriveinstitute.com and follow us on social media at ADHD Thrive Institute.